Hello, BookTube. As you know, as I pointed out the other day, there's a gigantic BookTube event that is hovering on the horizon, and that is Nonfiction November, created and hosted by the mighty Olive at A Book Olive, in which we are all encouraged to read more nonfiction. If you don't read any, if you've bought into nonfiction's bad PR as dusty schoolwork, then maybe take a few well-honed recommendations and break out of that and read one piece of nonfiction in the month of November. If you read nonfiction, maybe read more. In my own case, I read a huge amount of nonfiction anyway. I'm a huge champion of it. But I'm still going to increase the amount of nonfiction that I read. I'm essentially going to read nothing but nonfiction unless I'm being paid or to read fiction, or I'm a part of a group read on BookTube to read fiction. Otherwise, all the optional stuff is going away. Even the rereads that I do throughout the month will all be nonfiction. And the point of this video is to get back to that idea of recommending videos, because, of course, there's a vast ocean of great nonfiction out there that exists and that has existed since Herodotus. And you'll be getting tons and tons of recommendations along those lines from everybody, including myself. I made a bunch yesterday. But the publishing world just keeps going, right? The publishing world just keeps coming out with new books. Olive is intensely involved in that world now. She is a book reviewer, just like I am. We're constantly involved in the flood of new and upcoming books. And those new and upcoming nonfiction titles also include titles coming out in November. So I thought I would give you a quick rundown of some of the nonfiction that's coming out in November. The month of nonfiction, November. And we'll start with The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengram, which we've seen already on this channel, where the authors go back all the way to the beginning of human society and retell human history. And they intentionally break it away from its usual presuppositions. For instance, the rise of the state, which is a given in histories of humanity, that humans were hunter-gatherers, they were nomadic, then they domesticated animals, they established agriculture, they built cities, and once you have a city, you have organized religion, and you have the state. Often those two things are the same thing. And that you don't ever not have that. That you don't ever advance as a society unless you advance along those roads. And these two authors in The Dawn of Everything say, no, hold on a minute, let's examine all of that. And I was skeptical at first, but it's amazing. Just amazing. One of the best, most thought-provoking histories of humanity that's ever been written. So that will start off our November list that way. I haven't read all of these books, but boy, oh boy, have I read that one. The next one is Woodrow on the Beach by Jenna Bloom, which is about, it's autobiographical, of course. This is the 21st century, but it's also about having an older dog. And all that means, and what it can teach you, and not just the lessons that the dog themselves is teaching you, but the lessons of caring for an older dog. If you're a dog person, you should put it on your list. It's called Woodrow on the Beach. Next up is The Broken Constitution by Noah Feldman. This would have been of interest to me anyway, because I like the author, and that means a lot. In the Bank of Steve, your credit will largely depend on your own ability, rather than you covering a subject that I like. And Noah Feldman is a really good writer. He's really engaging. And The Broken Constitution is about a very thorny issue that doesn't get enough attention, which is Abraham Lincoln, being the President of the United States, trying to respect the Constitution of the United States, even if that Constitution technically allows all sorts of things to happen on his watch as president that he can't allow. Then what happens? Then what do you do? It's an amazing examination of Lincoln, the man, and Lincoln, the constitutional scholar. It's rare in the course of any given year that you will read, there are 100 Lincoln books in every year, but it's rare that you'll read even 2 that are any good. This is one of them. Then the next one is The Life of Picasso, The Minotaur Years, by John Richardson. And this is the final volume in Richardson's multi-volume, absolutely definitive life of Picasso. It's been a long time, decades and decades and decades, since Volume 1 in this series came out. I remember when it came out. I read it. I bought it at Crocs and Bontanos and read it, and you would never have dawned on me that we would not only be in a new millennium, but that would be well into a new millennium when the final book came out. But the final book is now out. is now coming out in November. This is a massive undertaking. There's no denying that. This is epical. No one will ever write a book or a series, a multi-volume biography of Picasso like this ever again. Maybe no one will ever want to. And no one will ever write a biography of Picasso again that won't heavily refer to these volumes by Richardson. So if you're a Picasso fan, first I would say, as Twitter says, what are you doing with your life? But if you're a Picasso fan, well, this series is now coming to an end. And it's dealing at the end with, I mean, Picasso made news right up until they nailed the coffin shut. And the final stage of his artistic career, if you want to call it that, has largely been written off. Even by Picasso-worshipping art fans, it's largely been written off as just inconsequential and perhaps borderline senile doodles. And Richardson has a completely different take on that subject. So if you're a Picasso fan and art fan, but also if you're a fan of the art of biography, this thing is coming out. And they don't make them like these very often anymore. The next one is What Just Happened by Charles Finch. Finch is a mystery writer. He writes a series of historical murder mysteries that are very, very good. They get better as they go along. And they were good to start with. But this isn't that. This is an autobiographical look of his at the last year and change. So, rumors of a new virus that suddenly became fact, suddenly became reality. The massive botching of the response to that, because a national emergency happened on the watch of the president least capable of dealing with that in the entire history of the country's presidents. And also that no matter how that president dealt with that catastrophe, always taking it personally, always thinking you're either on the virus's side or you're on mine. So, always doing stuff like that. And in addition to that, quite apart from that, that same president organized and incited a violent armed insurrection to attack the U.S. Capitol, execute his sitting vice president, and overturn an election, presumably. You don't have any other reason to do that other than to install yourself without an election. And if you don't need elections, then you don't ever get recalled from power, which is why I say the object was to install him as an unelected dictator for life. All of that happened, all that's reflected in this book. So we're going to get a lot of books like that, but I doubt we'll get many of them from a writer this talented. So I thought I'd put it on the list here. Then the next one is The Library by Andrew Pedigree and Arthur Dewetown. This is a big, fairly standard history of libraries in human society, where they developed, how they started, what they're like now, what challenges they undertake in the 21st century. In other words, not a new kind of approach, not a new thing by any means. There have been 50 books like this in the last 20 years. But it's really good, really well done, which is everything that matters, right? And there are no new ideas under the sun. Instead, it matters. Execution is everything, and this is really well done. You library fans out there. And the next one is Northern Exposure by Michael Samuel. This has come up on this channel a couple of times already. This is part of a series of books that looks at the cultural significance and history of certain TV shows. So this is not about the Arctic Circle. This is about the show Northern Exposure, the Brandon Falsey show Northern Exposure, that I loved. A lot of people loved it. It's gone now. But this book is not only about the details of putting that show together and putting it on the air, but also its significance, discussing it. If you're a Northern Exposure fan, you're going to want to read this book. And it comes out in November. Then we have Princess Mary by Elizabeth Basford. And this is a biography of the only daughter of King George V, who is at most a footnote in other House of Windsor histories. But here she gets her own book that shines a light on how unconventional she was, on how forward-thinking she was, on how wryly she looked at the weird status of her own celebrity. It looks to be very refreshing. I haven't read it yet, but I've never read a biography of this particular royal, so I'm looking forward to it. Then the next one, the next one I have read, I'm not just recommending things on this list. I'm pointing out nonfiction that's coming out in November, whether you would like it more than I would or not. If you like this book, you'll certainly like it more than I did. It's Will by Will Smith. With a substantial amount of help from Mark Manson. And it's an autobiography of the actor Will Smith. And Will Smith has a great PR team, and he is known as being a bankable star. If he is headlining a movie, people will go to it because it's the new Will Smith movie. They won't really care what the movie is. They'll just go to see the movie because of him. he has a rather good track record as being a bankable marquee star. He's done his best to hurt that ranking over time because he's headlined some really bad movies that are just mockably awful. And those movies always have one thing in common, especially in the last 10 years. And that one thing in common is the gradual revelation of something that's been true about Will Smith for 30, 40 years now. And that everybody in his private circle, everybody that knows him personally, knows perfectly well, which is that you would have to go a long way, perhaps all the way back to Napoleon Bonaparte, to find an egomaniac quite this big. And unfortunately, that just glows off every page of this book. It just glows off. So if you find Will Smith fascinating, and you're okay with a book that also finds Will Smith fascinating, then you'll be fine with this thing. The next one is also another biography. We have a few biographies in a row here. This next one is a bit of a struggle. This is the English language translation of Suzanne Schattenberg's biography of Leonid Brezhnev, who was premier of the Soviet Union for a long time, many, many years, and who was a misunderstood figure, according to this author, I gather. I haven't read the book yet, but I gather that this author consulted a vast amount of archives that no one's ever consulted before, including archives that have never been translated into English. So this is at least going to be, at 600 pages, a far more fleshed out and realistic portrait of Brezhnev than anybody's ever written before. It's easy to think of Brezhnev as a kind of darkly comic figure, but apparently he's not going to be in this book. I'll have to get back to you on whether or not it makes me rethink anything about a Soviet premier whose entire time in office I watched carefully as an adult, as a newspaper-buying, newspaper-subscribing adult. So it's living history to me, even though it's ancient history to everybody else. Then the next one is also a biography. This is The Last King of America by Andrew Roberts. This is his biography of King George III, the Hanoverian monarch who lost the American colonies for the British Empire. Not personal history for me. You Weisenheimers in the back row can stop your snickering. But this book is Andrew Roberts doing what he did for Napoleon the Great, his biography of Napoleon Bonaparte, saying that this is actually a great person. A wonderful, fantastic, personal, lovely person who only was kind to old ladies and puppies, and who had only forward-thinking ideas, and who was not the mad, bumbling, beetle-browed tyrant that the American press makes him out to be. Now, will Andrew Roberts convince you of that? He had access to a new archive of Georgian Hanoverian records released by Queen Elizabeth. So in that sense, this is the only George III biography to read, because none of the others have ever had access to that. And it's vast. It's 200,000 pages of documents. Whether or not Andrew Roberts convinces you, therefore, is up for grabs. He might. You never know. But you'll certainly enjoy it. He's a terrific writer. Just terrific. So you'll enjoy the ride, regardless of whether or not you buy into the argument. That's one of the fun of reading books like this. The next thing is something, again, we've seen on this channel, The Transcendentalists and Their World by John Gross. Big new study of Concord, Massachusetts, and all of the revolutionary writers and geniuses that came from there. Terrific, terrific stuff. If you have a limited shelf of American Transcendentalist books, this is one you have to have. And it's also really good reading. Then we have Powers and Thrones by Dan Jones. This is a one-volume history of the Middle Ages. And it also, these three in a row is really the case here. The thing that sells the book, of course, there have been a million histories of the Middle Ages. The thing that sells the book is Dan Jones. He's such a companionable writer that if you're interested in the subject, you'll want to read this book, see what kind of a job he does with it. The next one is an anthology of scholarly articles, and it's one I've mentioned before. It's After Jesus, Before Christianity. And it studies the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Before a codified, state-sponsored church took power. What was going on in all the various nodes and centers of Christianity? What was happening? And maybe how different it was from what it is like now. So I wanted to mention it again because it's worthwhile to bring it up to you people who like to read your Christian history. The next one is also something that's come up on this channel, Julius Caesar and the Roman People by Robert Morstein Marx. A challenging new look at Julius Caesar. Was he a thwarted populist, as opposed to the power-hungry, grabbing auto-dictator that most histories paint him as? This author makes a very strong case, a very informed case. Whether or not you end up agreeing, this is a Roman history book to have. Let's just barrel on, shall we? The next one is A Natural History of the Future by Rob Dunn, in which the author looks at certain immutable laws of biology in light of the apocalyptic state of nature today in the world, where we have half the planet is burning, toxins everywhere, the catastrophic climate change, climate collapse, right on the verge, when we know perfectly well that no industrial nation state, whether it's China or India or the United States or Russia, is ever going to try and change it. So that is going to happen. All the worst case scenarios are going to happen. And this book takes a step back and says, well, yes, all of those things will happen, but many of those things have happened before. It won't be the end of the world. It'll just be the end of humanity. It's fascinating. Just fascinating. Then we'll move on to Led Zeppelin, a big biography of the rock band by Bob Spitz. Fascinating, fantastically beautiful stuff. Bob Spitz is such a great writer. I swear he can do no wrong. I almost want to say he can do no wrong. His biography of Ronald Reagan was pretty bad. But I don't know that you'd notice that if you hadn't read every single word that's ever been written about Ronald Reagan, like yours truly. I would still entertain you. His books are certainly entertaining, and his book on the Beatles now has a companion. His book on Led Zeppelin is also great. What I wouldn't give to see him do make this a trilogy. Give us a book. Give us a Bob Spitz book on the Rolling Stones. Oh wow, that's incredible. Where does that leave us? Oh yes, These Precious Days by Ann Patchett. The author of novels, you'll mostly know her from Bel Canto. This is a collection of nonfiction pieces, and they are fantastic. Just fantastic. Most of them have appeared in periodical literature before, but having them together and reading them as one, they were clearly conceived in one frame of mind as one tapestry, and they read better for it. So I strongly, strongly recommend it. Then we have, shall we do another biography? Yes, let's do another biography, a big fat biography by Jay Cost of James Madison. It's coming out in November. Madison is a much studied but fairly opaque founding father. Here he gets a big, spirited new book. Then there's Audienceology by Kevin Getz, which is about an aspect of the movie industry that maybe doesn't get a lot of coverage. We know that it exists, but this, I think, is the first full-length, really, really detailed book about it. And that phenomenon is audience testing. Test screeners for audiences, not advanced screeners for movie critics, and not opening night, but rather the screening that's done for test audiences. I can't wait to read it. That is a fascinating subject, because the author doesn't just describe what that process is like. The author also makes a case for how that process changes movies. I'm all for it. And then another biography, another thing I mentioned on this channel here before, Albert Camus and the Human Crisis by Robert Meagher. Robert Meagher is a Camus scholar, and this is a big literate biography, multi-parts, multifaceted. Can't wait to read it, wondering if it will spark a change in my estimate of Camus. I would certainly love to love Camus as much as his fans do. Maybe it will. Let's see here. What's next? Oh, yes, another big, huge thing coming from Liverite. The big, gigantic collection of the diaries and journal entries of Patricia Highsmith, who you'll know from her mystery novel, Strangers on a Train, the Ripley novels. These are her pouring her heart out to her journals about her lesbian love affairs, about her interactions with her publishers, maybe some interactions with readers. I am a sucker for these kinds of books. I just love them. Naturally, I always say this at every month of the year. For Nonfiction November, I will stress it. I always find these nonfiction books more interesting than the novels that the authors wrote. And if you do too, you've got a huge one for Patricia Highsmith coming out. Then another big book, Island Infernos by John McManus. We've seen it on this channel. It's the second book of his studying the nitty-gritty of the Army in the Pacific War theater of World War II. And really nitty-gritty. We're talking about soldiers going into jungles with 200-foot crevasses, poisonous animals everywhere, and enemy soldiers that could be hidden anywhere, to even an individual soldier. And yet there's a broader strategy. There had to be a broader island-hopping strategy to slowly curtail all of the territorial conquests of the Empire of Japan. McManus already proved with his first book, Fire and Fortitude, he already proved to me that he knows how to do this really well, so the second book is a guarantee. Then a nice big book edited by Barry Day called Noel Coward, on and in the theater. Noel Coward on and in the theater, which is a study of Noel Coward and his theatrical life, but also all of his writings about the theater, collected and analyzed in this book. Lots and lots of critical augmentation. If you're a theater fan or a Noel Coward fan, oh my, this is a volume you have long been waiting for. It's actually a volume of this type, something along these lines, something that Noel Coward himself promised to write forever and ever and never did. A feast. Coward was effortlessly eloquent all the time. So, actually, so was Patricia Highsmith. So her collection of letters is going to give you that as well. Then we have an oddity of a book. I loved it because I love the era, and I also love the author. It's a specialty thing, so your mileage may vary. It's Wish It Lasted Forever by the great Boston writer Dan Shaughnessy, the author of The Curse of the Bambino. And this is about the Larry Bird era of the Boston Celtics, a basketball team franchise here in America. There was a time, Denny Ainge, Larry Bird, the Chief, there was a time when the Celtics were great, and they were magnetic to watch on the court. And Shaughnessy loved that time. It formed him as a fan of the game and also as a writer of the game, and here he writes about it. So you would have to like basketball. You would probably have to know a little bit about that era if that is your sweet spot. If you remember the 1980s Celtics, then this is the ultimate book because it's by the ultimate writer. Same theme that's been running throughout here. It's the writer that makes the difference. What else have we got here? The Last Bookseller by Gary Goodman. A little bit of a hyperbolic title, but it's about a guy who stumbles into the world and the art and the craft and the arcana of rare book dealing in the American Midwest. I'll always read a book like that, even though I don't care anything about rare books. I still think it's fascinating. The anecdotes alone. Then we have let's see here. What's next on the list? The Good Kings by Kara Cooney. I think I mentioned this before. It's about ancient Egypt. By an author who has a great deal of experience writing about ancient Egypt under her name and other names as well. And if your sweet spot, again, to mention your sweet spot, if your sweet spot is for ancient Egypt, this is probably going to be the best and most readable book on that subject that comes out this year. So, a word to the wise. Then another oddity, much like the Dan Shaughnessy Boston Celtics book. And again, it will entirely depend on whether or not it is exactly what you want. Although, in this case, the exactly what you want audience will be bigger because the author is Haruki Murakami. The new Murakami book is about his t-shirt collection. The type of folly that only a world-acknowledged great writer, acknowledged by everybody except the Nobel Prize Committee, can get away with. Only a living Margaret Atwood or a living Haruki Murakami can write a book about their favorite lentil recipes and count on it to be printed and also sell. Murakami has a fetish with t-shirts. He has a million of them, and he has stories behind all of them. So if you love Murakami's writing, if you're a Murakami completist, you're going to want this book. Then another work of history that I've mentioned on this channel before, Our First Civil War by H.W. Brands. This is coming out in November, and it's a study of American versus American. It's a study of the very small percentage of colonists who wanted to break away from the British Republic, and the huge majority of colonists who did not, the Loyalists. And what happens when they are fighting against their neighbors, and also what happens when they realize they're going to lose? What happens when they realize that not only is the revolution going to succeed, but that everybody around them knows what side they were on? Brands is terrific anyway. Those of you who read this guy's works will know that already, so you won't need me to convince you to get this new book. But the new book has a fascinating subject anyway. Then a biography, Scientist by Richard Rhodes. Richard Rhodes is also familiar to you, I'm sure, to any of you history fans, for his writings about the atomic bomb. Here he writes a biography of E.O. Wilson of Harvard. The ant guy, as he's familiarly known, the ant guy, but also an evolutionary biologist, a writer on evolution and on the natural world. And again, E.O. Wilson knew that he wanted to study ants from a very, very early age and did nothing for the whole of his life but study ants. So again, much is going to depend on the skill of the author. Unfortunately, we know that Robert Rhodes is really skilled. So, and the next one is also a biography, and it's also shown up on this channel, and it will also be a bit of a specialty item. It's Benedict XVI. It's Peter Sewald's second volume in his 2-volume biography of Benedict XVI, who retired as Pope. He's still alive. Once held the office, called all of his bishops together, his archbishops together, and said they had no idea what the subject was, and he surprised them by saying, I'm going to retire, so you need to pick a new pope. Sewald writes about him from his early youth, from the controversial time period in which he was involved with the Nazi youth, all the way to the even more controversial period covered in the second volume, which is out in November, in which Benedict was presiding over a Catholic church where knowledge of sex scandals was erupting everywhere, rape scandals. And it all happened on his watch, and he was directly involved. He was directly involved in hiding the guilt of predatory priests and moving them around from parish to parish without telling anybody what their past was like. An impossible thing to absolve him of. And this volume deals very intelligently with that and with a whole bunch of other subjects, including Vatican II, which for a lot of you Catholics out there will be seminal as an event. So, again, it's an undertaking. Probably this volume is best read in conjunction with Volume 1. But if you are a fan, if you are interested in the papacy, if you're a Catholic, you want to know about Benedict was by default a seismically important figure. Then you probably want this book, and we'll finish up. We'll finish up with one last thing. I could go on, but we'll finish up for this Nonfiction November Nonfiction recommendation list with a book by Heather Hansman called Powder Days, which is about her adventures as a ski bum, following the seasons, giving instructions in order to get flophouse money, that sort of thing. A life that she doesn't hit this point very hard. She's a wonderful, again, very companionable author. But you can't help but read the book without thinking, well, how long does this life have to go? Right? How long is catastrophic climate change going to allow the life of a beach bum to even exist? Is it possible that Heather Hansman, as a 90-year-old woman, will be telling stories to her grandchildren about what it was like when there was a thing called skiing in the Northern Hemisphere? She doesn't hit that point. It'll probably be on your mind, but if you love to ski, for instance, or if you've ever been a ski bum, I've known a couple of them. Not people taking a skiing vacation to Vail or Telluride or whatever, but people who decided to dedicate their life to skiing for the course of a season. Flop in a room with a bunch of other people, pick up some spending money by being an instructor or a chairlift operator or whatever, and just do the season. If it sounds a little druggy, it is. The drug you're pursuing is the adrenaline high of skiing itself, and you're willing to do anything in order to keep that coming. And ski bums that I have known actually do detox when the season is finally over and they have to go back home. They actually they don't call it that. No one ever acknowledged that that's what was happening. But they had all of the impossibility to concentrate, jittery hands, short temper, because they had been indulging in a drug addiction for an entire season. Makes for tremendously evocative reading. It's not the only example. I could double this list. Another example on this list would be a guy who fly fishes for an entire season. All kinds of different places. And whether you're interested in fly fishing or not, it's fascinating. Same thing with Powder Days. So I thought I'd end on an exotic note. And that is a little bit of a Nonfiction November Nonfiction list, but I could do many of these. We'll talk about many nonfiction books in November itself, but I wanted to make this list just in case you're, thinking about getting your nonfiction from your library. For instance, since not everybody has a ton of money, the list that I've just given you would cost several $1,000s to buy. But now that you know they're coming, you could get your library to get them in for November. That's a thought. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.